After a viral video showed an incident of racial profiling, Starbucks closed all its stores across the United States for one afternoon. But why? To provide racial bias education to all of its staff. But is that really the solution? And are these kind of incidents happening far more often than people realise? So what does the Starbucks scandal tell us about America today?
They didn't do anything. I saw the entire thing. They didn't.
This is So What, the series where we look at stories from around the world, stories that you should know about. And today, we're talking about how an incident in a shop owned by one of the country's biggest chains tells us a huge amount about everyday discrimination in America. Now, back on April the 12th, Rashon Nelson and Dante Robinson walked into a Starbucks in Philadelphia. The two men wanted to use the restroom, but they were refused because they hadn't bought anything. So they sat down, but then they were asked to leave. And they said they wouldn't because they were waiting for a friend. So a Starbucks employee called the police and the men were arrested.
What did they get called for? Because there were two black guys sitting here meeting me? Yes. Well, what did they do? What did they do? Did someone tell me what they did?
They didn't do anything. I saw the entire thing.
They didn't. What did they do?
The video caused widespread outrage. The police and Starbucks had to apologise, and the CEO of the coffee chain even met with the men face to face. In response, Starbucks held an afternoon of racial bias training for all of its employees across America.
This is mandatory training. From me to every barista and everyone in between, we are all going to go through this together. It will become a part of the new partner training for all Starbucks partners. Now, this is just one step in the journey. There are many more to take, but it's an important step.
So what is racial bias training anyway? I spoke to Dennis Chin from Race Forward to find out what this type of education actually entails.
Starbucks employees are going to learn how our brains are hardwired for bias. And what I mean by that is that we make snap judgments and assumptions about people, often unconsciously because of their race, age, gender, and so on. And they're going to learn that it's a universal phenomenon, by which I mean we all carry implicit biases.
But is an afternoon of training enough to be effective? We're talking about unconscious racial bias, something grounded in centuries of racism. Chin thinks that companies like Starbucks need to do more than just address individual examples of racial profiling. They need to challenge systemic, institutionalized racism. But what exactly would that look like? Well, he uses the example of a restaurant where usually people of color work at the back, washing dishes or preparing food, and where those working front of house tend to be white. Chin says that individually training people won't stop this form of occupational segregation. Organizations and institutions need to do something far bigger.
So, for example, some restaurants are now proactively recruiting qualified people of color for those front of house positions. I think some restaurants have instituted cross-promotional policies. So if you work in the back of the house, there's an opportunity for you to get a position in the front of the house. Some restaurants have subsidized English language classes, knowing that that's a skill that you need for some front of the house positions.
So what about racial bias across the United States? It's not just about employers and employees. There have been a number of viral videos recently that show that what happened at Starbucks isn't really that unusual. It happens in other places and it happens often. The difference is these days is that because of smartphones and social media, more people are seeing what's actually happening. Videos like this one, where police were called to Yale University after a white student found a black woman asleep in a common area. The African-American girl was actually a Yale student.
You got your ID on you?
Yeah, I do.
All right, can we see that?
Why?
We got a police call for you.
We need to make sure that you belong here.
Okay, let me open my apartment for you so that you can see that I belong here.
For some, this comes as a shock. And for others, like Andy Shalal, it doesn't. Born in Iraq, he's the founder of a successful chain of restaurants in Washington, D.C. He regularly holds conversations about race with his employees and says that these videos surprise only those who are unaware of what people of color have to deal with on a daily basis.
I think that's the power of privilege, is the ability to just live, be a human being, and not worry about where you're coming from, who you are. I'm a Muslim, I'm a male. And when I go to the airport, still today, I have to think hard about what I'm carrying, what I have in my bag.
Another widely shared video showed a white woman calling the police because two African-American men were having a barbecue in a public park. Not that they were violating any laws. The police were called anyway.
It's illegal to have a charcoal grill in the park here.
No, it's not actually. I just looked at the map.
is.
It says this is a designated barbecue area.
No.
In response, residents held a barbecue in while black event in the exact same spot, and hundreds came out in support. I spoke to one of the organisers, Jamel Robinson, about the event.
You know, a large chunk of it was just showing like unity, love, togetherness. At the end of the day, that's all barbecuing while black is about, showing like we can all come together and we don't have to bicker with each other. The woman said she was afraid for her life, you know, around 7 people. Okay, now we have 2,000 people here and not one single problem has taken place.
So what is happening to America's dialogue on race? To understand the context within which this whole debate takes place, you have to go back to the summer of 2014. And that's when in Ferguson, Missouri, a white police officer shot dead Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager. And that sparked days of rioting and a national dialogue about the relationship between African Americans and law enforcement. It also gave rise to Black Lives Matter, a contemporary civil rights movement highlighting America's systemic, ongoing racism. Both Jamel and Andy told me that social media is helping to expose the blatant racism of today in America.
Of course, legally, things have changed dramatically, you know, since I came to this country almost 50 years ago. But on a hearts and minds level, not so much. You know, I think that we still have a long ways to go there. And we can't move forward unless we have an opportunity to intersect with each other, understand where other viewpoints come from and why they come from there, understand the fears and motivations that bring us to where we are.
President Barack Obama often said that his election was not a conclusion to America's race problem, and that the US has not yet become a post-racial society. But these viral videos are doing 2 important things. 1, they're showing that everyday racism exists in many forms. And 2, they're highlighting that what leads to the confrontations between police and African Americans is that sometimes officers get called to a scene when there is no scene at all. One afternoon of training may make a small contribution to alerting Starbucks employees to their own, everyday, unconscious racism. But there is no quick fix. There is not one simple solution to what is an historic and entrenched structural problem in this country.
It's about the process of interrogating systemic racial bias. That is the work. And I think sometimes what is the barrier is that folks get too focused on the individual, about racist people. And for us, in order for us to transform our systems, to really create a just and fair, welcoming environment for all, we have to address racist systems.